The decision to have children is becoming more and more fraught. For some, it's not just a matter of whether they want them, but whether it's fair to bring children into a world dealing with wars, the housing crisis, the cost of living, and most likely an environment ravaged by the climate crisis. Philosopher David Benatar's view is that even before all that, to come into existence is to be born into a life of suffering, and that it is immoral to have children because they'll inevitably experience pain and suffering. It's referred to as anti-natalism, and David joins me now. Professor, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you, albeit remotely.
There are other anti-natalist thinkers who make a sort of similar axiological argument, but there is a spectrum here. I think that's important to say up front. You are a compassionate anti-natalist as opposed to a misanthropic anti-natalist. What is the difference here?
Well, actually, I've advanced both kinds of arguments. The fundamental one for me, though, is a philanthropic argument. It's a concern for the being who's brought into existence. And my view is that whomever you create is going to have significant suffering in their life, and they're going to die. And they could have been spared all of that without any cost to themselves if they had never been conceived, never been brought into existence. And so I think we do always harm somebody by creating them. So that's my dominant argument. A misanthropic argument is really concerned with the harm that a human you create will do to others. And those others can be other human beings, they can be other animals, it might be mediated through environmental damage. And so it's important to note that the philanthropic and the misanthropic arguments are not mutually exclusive, they're not incompatible. Somebody could be motivated by both. They could be concerned both about this individual who's being created and also about the impact that this person will have on others.
The root of this immorality, though, at the very core of the argument is that having children, there's this asymmetry between pleasure and pain. What do you mean by this argument?
Well, pleasure and pain, they're really just placeholders for broader concepts of benefit and harm. And so I think it is the case that there is an asymmetry. I think that the absence of bad things is good, even if there's nobody who's going to experience that good. So, for example, there were a child you could create and that child would have a life of suffering and you avoid creating that child, the absence of that suffering is a good thing. What's different about pleasure and benefits is that their absence is only bad if there is somebody who is deprived of them. So if you, for example, are deprived of some pleasure or some other good, then that's bad. But if the reason why there's an absent pleasure or some other absent good is because there's just nobody there to have that good, then I don't think that's bad. So that's the asymmetry and the part of the asymmetry argument, but that really forms only part of the overall case for antinatalism.
What do we define as suffering? How small can the suffering be to encourage this asymmetry, as you put it?
I think it applies to suffering of any magnitude. And so in principle, even the smallest amount of suffering in a life would make it the case that it's better not to be born. But it doesn't follow from that.
For example, would be enough to warrant perhaps a better existence, meaning without it?
Well, I think there's a difference between saying whether existence is a net harm and whether it's wrong to bring a being into existence. So I think that if life had only a small modicum of pain in it, it would still be a net harm, but it would be a very small net harm. And because there might be many other goods associated with procreation, goods for other people, it might not be wrong in a circumstance like that to create somebody. But because, in fact, lives have much more than just a little bit of suffering, because, in fact, they are quite replete with suffering, and because they all end in that very severe harm of death, I think it's the case that it's not simply harmful, but also wrongful to create somebody.
Obviously, we can't remove the mortality factor to existence, but for you, it's not about trying to improve the world such that we remove any sort of challenge, pain or uncomfortableness, because that's pretty much impossible. But is there any lifestyle or pattern of existence that you see currently around the world as dealing with less suffering? For example, the high standard of living in Scandinavian countries, perhaps?
Well, let me say that I'm fully in favor of anything that we can do to improve the quality of human and other lives. So anti-natalism doesn't commit you to a resigned state whereby you just accept all the suffering that there is. It's fully compatible with doing what you can to minimize suffering and other harms that humans and other animals experience. It's just that the only way you can guarantee that a being is not going to suffer is by not creating that being in the first place. And so what I would say is one thing you should do is not have children. And another thing you should do is try to minimize the suffering of already existing beings.
If you've just joined me on RN Drive, I'm speaking with Professor David Benatar from the University of Cape Town. We're talking about the philosophy of anti-natalism, i.e. the belief that morally it's better for a child not to be born. You can hear him speak in Sydney later this month. I'll give you some details in just a minute. So some might argue that although life invariably involves suffering at any degree, that mostly life is a net positive. And that's not your view. I just want you to sort of meet that, because I think I can hear my listeners perhaps asking that of you.
You're correct. I don't think it's a net positive. And I don't think that people's ordinary judgments about these matters are reliable. I think there's a long evolutionary history that explains why psychologically we will think that life has more good than bad. But if we begin to look at it in a kind of barefaced way, an honest way, I think we'll see that there is more bad than good. And I'll just give you a few examples. If you think about pains and pleasures, the worst pains are much worse than the best pleasures are good. And if you deny that, ask yourself whether you would accept this deal. The deal is that you get an hour of the most sublime pleasure that there is imaginable in exchange, let's say, for 15 minutes of the worst pain imaginable. Would you take that deal? I think most rational people wouldn't. Another example is such a phenomenon as chronic pain. Pain just goes on and on and on. There's no such thing as chronic pleasure. Nobody suffers, in scare quotes, from a condition of that kind. So these are just two examples. But if we step through all the harms and benefits in life, I think we find that there's definitely much more bad than good, even if our psychology precludes our seeing that.
So we can't change the fact that you and I were both born. That's happened. The future perhaps has a bearing in terms of us not reproducing there, but we can't change the fact that we currently exist. We're having this conversation because we were both born. How do we make the best of this quote-unquote bad situation?
Well, you can do what you can to ameliorate your own condition, to prevent it from getting worse. And another thing that you can do is try to avoid the suffering of others. As I say, the best way to do that is by not creating them in the first place. But there are other ways for the already existing beings, or for beings who will exist independently of our own choices. There's much that we can do to minimize the harm to those beings. And there are a variety of ways of doing that. And I would think that's all part of a good life.
Accepting that it is suffering is obviously a central tenet of Buddhism, and Buddhists can then go on to find joy and happiness and pleasure. It's not equal to that suffering, but it still exists. Is that enough to equal up that ledger in your mind?
I don't think so. I think what Buddhists are doing is they're recognizing the fundamental feature of existence, which is that of suffering. Obviously, they don't deny that there can be pleasures. Anybody who denied that there are pleasures would be denying reality or some feature of reality. So that is not central or crucial or even part of my view at all. All I'm saying is that the bad overall outweighs the good when we're considering about whether to bring somebody into existence. So once we're here, get the joy that you can get and give the joy that you can give.
I'm struck by your comment about the fact that there is no such thing as chronic pleasure. I think that's very terribly and quite darkly funny. But then some might see death as the end of chronic pain or the end of suffering. But to you, death is not the answer, not directly to that question. What do you mean?
Well, I think that whenever death occurs, it is bad for the being who dies. There's some philosophers who disagree with that. I can't here summarize those arguments, but most people, I think, recognize that death is bad. Now, there are circumstances in which it is the lesser of two evils. But those are relatively rare circumstances. So it could be that the suffering becomes so intolerable that just release is the best thing for you. And if death is the only way in which you can gain that release, then it may be the lesser of two evils. I just don't think that that is the solution for all of us, all of the time, because one of the features of the human predicament is that our lives lack meaning. And I think that if we take our lives early, we preclude the opportunity to create more meaning by living longer and doing good things. So we're really caught between a rock and a hard place. Yes, life is laden with suffering. It also ends, which is bad for us. And so this is why it's a real predicament.
I know you've spoken about your vegan philosophy, and I feel like that's relevant to this conversation. Your idea that, all sentient creatures are harmed, particularly when consumed by another sentient creature. What about your own personal views on procreation? Because I haven't heard you speak about whether you have a family or not.
I don't really talk about myself personally. I talk about the arguments and the ideas. I do think there's a connection between veganism and anti-natalism. The precise connection is open to some debate and discussion, but both, I think, are views that seek to minimize suffering. So one argument that's often given in favor of eating meat is that if humans didn't eat animals, those animals that they eat would never have been created in the first place. And so actually we're doing them a favor by creating them and then killing them and eating them. And I find this a really obnoxious argument for many reasons. One of them is that the animals that are brought into existence are often brought into an existence of extreme suffering if they reared in factory farms. And so by no stretch of the imagination could it be said that we're benefiting them. But even if an animal were to have a relatively good quality of life and then have its life terminated early, I don't think that we're doing that animal a favor any more than if we were to create a human in order to eat it. If we were to create a human in order to eat him or her, we would be doing a very serious harm by killing that human being. And I don't think that we would say we've done a net benefit to that person by creating and killing them rather than by not creating them in the first place.
I'm curious if you think that this immoralism behind procreation is a static thing. For example, given the way the world is today, the probability that life will continue to get more difficult given climate change, etc., overpopulation, although that is seemingly less of a concern according to current projections. But do you see that this immoral aspect of reproduction can increase or decrease over time?
I think it varies really from individual circumstance to individual circumstance. So the worse the life of the being that you create, the worse it is to have created that being or to create that being. And that can really vary from place to place, also from time to time. I don't think that there's a linear movement here whereby lives are getting better or getting worse. It depends on all kinds of circumstances. But certainly, if you've got good grounds for thinking that your child is going to suffer unusually, and that's worse than if you've got less good grounds for thinking that the suffering will be unusual. Not that that second case is bad, it is good, it's just less bad.
Well, I, for one, am glad that you were born for us to at least have this conversation today. My guest has been Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town, David Benatar. You can read his book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, and he's speaking at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas on Sunday, the 25th of August in Sydney. Professor, lovely to talk to you.
Good to speak to you too. Thanks very much.